It was February 17th, 1943. German forces advanced cautiously across the Tunisian desert, the sand sticking to boots and weapons, each step heavy with fatigue. Colonel Friedrich Steiner, 48, a career officer with a stern jaw and eyes that had seen too much, surveyed his men. They were gaunt, hollow-cheeked, and weary, many having survived weeks of minimal rations, thin black bread, ersatz coffee, and watery soup. His soldiers whispered about hunger constantly. Morale was fragile, bodies were weakened. Every man carried the invisible weight of starvation, their hands trembling not from fear, but from chronic exhaustion, their eyes reflecting the slow erosion of strength and spirit. Steiner had spent weeks counting the losses, not from battle alone, but from the attrition of malnutrition, the way soldiers dropped their rifles mid-march because their limbs refused to obey. He had seen men collapse on dunes, with the sand sticking to their sweat and tears, unable to rise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Scouts reported the American supply depot near Farana, Tunisia, had been lightly defended. Steiner felt both relief and suspicion. They had struggled to maintain supply lines across the desert. Fuel, ammunition, and especially food were scarce. Every convoy that made it past British patrols had been partially looted by desperate troops or bogged down by the merciless terrain. Trucks had broken down under the relentless sun, engines scorched, tires melting into the sand, and horses, too, had perished, leaving columns stranded with nowhere to turn. Now, with the depot in sight, Steiner allowed himself a glimmer of hope. The sun rose pale orange over the horizon, reflecting off the sand and making the distant crates appear like a mirage, almost too surreal to believe. The depot sprawled across several acres, wooden crates stacked in orderly rows, each stamped with American military markings. Steiner ordered his men to secure the area. What they found inside stunned them. Mountains of food, untouched and abundant, lined the compound. Crates of K rations, type A and B field rations, canned meats, fresh vegetables, chocolate, coffee, sugar, and even ice cream mix formed towers higher than a man. The scent of fresh bread and preserved fruit filled the air, contrasting violently with the stench of sweat, dust, and hunger that clung to the German soldiers like a second skin. They stumbled between the crates, hands brushing over tins of corned beef and biscuits, frozen meals that could feed one man for 3 days in a single package, jars of peanut butter, powdered milk, and condensed cream. Each item was carefully labeled, a testament to American planning and attention to detail, and each one struck Steiner with the force of a revelation. His troops had been denied not only sustenance, but the dignity of proper nourishment. He called his officers together, speaking quietly, almost to himself. They are not just better armed. They are better fed. A soldier cannot fight well on hunger alone. The words settled over them, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth they had long tried to ignore. Captain Wilhelm Kruger, 35, a man whose eyes had once burned with the confidence of youth, touched a tin of powdered eggs almost reverently. "We have been starving while they live like kings," he muttered. The depot was more than a collection of rations. It was a demonstration of industrial capacity, planning, and the logistical intelligence that Germany had failed to match. Each crate told a story of production lines in Chicago, Detroit, and New York, of refrigeration trucks and rail cars moving across continents, of men and women behind the scenes whose labor ensured that an American soldier in North Africa would never go hungry. Steiner realized that the Americans had not merely fought battles, they had fought logistics, and they had won. Among the K rations, German soldiers found tins containing 3 separate meals: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each meal came in its own compact package, approximately the size of 2 cigarette packs stacked together. Inside breakfast tins were chopped ham and scrambled eggs, cooked and ready to eat. Alongside them were 4 hard biscuits, a compressed fruit bar, instant coffee packets, sugar tablets, chewing gum, cigarettes, and even miniature rolls of toilet paper. These were emergency rations, the lowest quality meals the Americans issued in the field, yet they dwarfed the rations Steiner's men had survived on for weeks. In practice, with field kitchens operational and the Type A and B rations available, American soldiers consumed between 3,400 and 4,100 calories per day, depending on activity level. German troops, by comparison, often received barely 1,500 calories on a good day, and the quality of their food had deteriorated under the strain of extended campaigns. Steiner observed his men, some reaching out to touch tins of canned fruit, while others sat on the crates, their heads in their hands. Their stomachs ached in recognition, not just from hunger, but from the bitter understanding of inequity. Sergeant Heinz Müller, 27, who had marched over 200 miles since early January with nothing but a loaf of black bread, whispered, "It is almost cruel." He stared at a pile of chocolate bars stacked neatly in open crates, imagining how such luxuries must taste. The juxtaposition was unbearable. Soldiers who had endured frostbite and desert fever, whose teeth had cracked from ersatz coffee and whose bones ached from malnutrition, now confronted abundance that seemed designed to humiliate. Steiner walked through the depot, cataloguing what he saw. There were rows of canned vegetables, carrots, peas and beans, large tins of roast beef, chicken and pork, powdered eggs in cylindrical metal containers, stacks of flour, sacks of rice, bottles of cooking oil, coffee dark and aromatic in quantities that would last a division for months, sugar by the ton, salt, spices, and even ice cream mix that could produce frozen desserts for entire regiments. He picked up a container of condensed milk, opening it slightly to smell the sweet richness. Memories of his own family, of meals eaten in comfort decades before the war, struck him suddenly. He clenched the tin, almost in anger, feeling the gap between past and present, hunger and plenty. By mid-morning, his men had begun to raid the depot, not for malice, but from necessity. They tore into the K-ration boxes, devouring biscuits and tinned meats, eyes wide as their stomachs finally recognized nourishment. Some fell to their knees in silent gratitude, others laughed shakily, tears mingling with sand and sweat. Steiner allowed it, watching carefully, aware that this indulgence was temporary. There would be no way to transport this bounty back to the front, no way to feed every hungry throat in his command. Yet, even temporary reprieve reminded him that the Americans had solved a problem he could not, sustaining soldiers at the peak of physical capacity for sustained operations in hostile environments. Steiner returned to his command post, a small canvas tent pitched hastily near the edge of the depot. He pored over captured documents, ration manifests, and supply logs, noting the precision with which American logistics had been organized. Detailed schedules for replenishing fresh fruit, instructions for rotating K-ration stock, lists of calories per soldier, per day, per meal. Every element calculated, every need anticipated. American soldiers were not merely fighting, they were being fought for by an entire industrial and logistical network. In contrast, his own soldiers scavenged from desert carcasses, rationed flour and water, and depended on trucks that often never arrived. He ran his hands over his face, exhausted by the clarity of failure he could not deny. Lieutenant Carl Fischer, 32, approached him quietly, holding a small pile of ration cards he had collected from empty crates. "Colonel, they have field kitchens that can prepare hot meals twice daily in the desert," he said, his voice trembling. "Hot meals in the sand for hundreds of men at a time. And ice cream. Ice cream in February. In the desert." Steiner nodded grimly, the picture of efficiency and abundance forming fully in his mind. He imagined his men, starved, freezing at night, fighting against exhaustion, while the enemy enjoyed calories that sustained both body and morale. That night, as the German camp settled on the outskirts of Farana, Steiner walked idly past his men, who slept haphazardly among their rifles and backpacks. He reflected on what they had seen. The American approach to feeding troops was not indulgent. It was strategic. Soldiers who consumed 3,500 calories per day with real meat, coffee, and fruit were alert, strong, and capable of rapid movement. Soldiers with only 1,500 calories, often comprised of bread and watery soup, were prone to fatigue, disease, and mistakes. He realized that victory in the desert was not decided by courage alone or by machine guns and tanks, but by who could sustain life itself. Steiner made notes in his journal by the light of a flickering lantern. He detailed the crates, the caloric content, the efficiency of American supply chains, and the stark contrast with German distribution. Every word was a reckoning. They fight with full bellies. We fight with empty ones. A soldier dies on hunger before the bullet reaches him. Outside, the wind swept across the desert, carrying the scent of sand, oil, and distant smoke from skirmishes along the outskirts of the Tunisian coast. He listened to the quiet murmurs of men discovering real food for the first time in weeks. By dawn, February 18th, Steiner ordered his men to withdraw from the depot, taking only what they could carry in backpacks and onto trucks that were scarcely functional. Some tins were emptied into satchels, biscuits broken in half to share. The rest, thousands of pounds of provisions, remained behind untouched. The Americans would return, they would replenish, and their soldiers would continue to eat well, while Steiner's men subsisted on what the desert could provide. He watched the horizon, the first light glinting off the depot like a jewel, and knew that the war was not just about bullets and bombs. It was about the simple, relentless arithmetic of calories, planning, and human endurance. Steiner would carry the lesson of Farana with him for the rest of the campaign. A soldier cannot fight on an empty stomach, and an army that cannot feed its men is already on the path to defeat. The contrast was painfully clear. American soldiers would march, fight, and hold positions with energy and morale intact. German soldiers, no matter their valor, would falter under the invisible weight of hunger. And for the first time, Steiner understood that even the most disciplined troops were powerless against a well-fed adversary. He closed his journal and looked out over the depot one last time. Crates of food stretched farther than his eyes could see, stacked higher than the sand dunes themselves. Chocolate, canned meats, coffee, biscuits, fresh fruit, powdered milk, ice cream, and sugar glimmered in the early sunlight like trophies of an industrial civilization far stronger than his own. Steiner turned back to his men, their faces gaunt, their stomachs aching, and he whispered quietly, "Feed a man well, and he can fight. Starve him, and no weapon will make him strong." The words lingered in the air as the columns of German soldiers withdrew, the Farana depot receding in the distance. German soldiers had long survived on scraps. Official Wehrmacht rations were sufficient on paper, 3,600 calories per day. But the reality in North Africa, and even more so in the Soviet Union, was brutal. By early 1943, frontline men were receiving only 1,500 to 1,800 calories a day, a fraction of what was required to maintain strength under the relentless desert sun. Thin soup, black bread, interlaced with sawdust, and occasionally canned meat formed the bulk of sustenance. Salt was scarce, sugar almost non-existent, and fresh water rationed carefully so that a single man might receive barely 1.5 liters per 24 hours. Morale plummeted as soldiers wrestled with the physical and psychological consequences of hunger. Fatigue became a constant companion. Knees buckled under the weight of backpacks loaded with rifles and ammunition. Sunburned faces cracked, lips split, and muscles twitched involuntarily. Spasms caused by deficiency in potassium and magnesium, silent punishments delivered by the unforgiving desert. The men whispered, not just about food, but about dreams of bread, chocolate, or even the smell of roasted meat, memories that had begun to fade from their consciousness like faint echoes from a past life. Meanwhile, the Americans thrived on efficiency and foresight. Every K ration contained 3 full meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, packed compactly with cooked eggs, ham, biscuits, fruit bars, and instant coffee. A single soldier could carry several days' worth in his pack without it becoming cumbersome. Each calorie, each ounce, had been measured meticulously by engineers and dietitians, ensuring that no man went hungry and that every ounce of energy expended in combat was replenished. Soldiers consuming K rations in the field were ingesting nearly 3,000 calories a day. With supplementary rations, fresh or canned, total intake often exceeded 4,000 calories daily, depending on activity level. American supply chains were unmatched. Convoys moved across the desert and jungle alike, escorted by trucks armored lightly against raids but fast enough to outpace enemy patrols. Mobile field kitchens, constructed on truck chassis, could feed hundreds of men hot meals, even at the front line. These kitchens produced scrambled eggs with butter, hot coffee, freshly baked bread, and vegetables cooked in olive oil, sustaining both body and morale. Where German troops ached with fatigue, Americans marched alert and strong, capable of rapid maneuvers and enduring the heat of the sun without collapse. Steiner's officers circulated among the captured crates, incredulous. Private Wilhelm Kruger, 24, gingerly picked up a tin of chocolate, turning it over in his hand as if unsure it was real. Sergeant Dietrich Müller, 27, pried open a box of canned eggs and sniffed at the preserved food, the scent sharp and rich, intoxicating after weeks of hunger. They laughed, nervously, an absurd, bitter sound that reverberated over the sand like the hollow echo of empty stomachs. "It is excessive," Muller muttered, his voice low, almost ashamed. "How can one army fight while the other feasts?" Steiner did not answer. The truth was too stark. This imbalance of nutrition would not merely sap stamina, it would influence strategy, endurance, and the outcome of every engagement. An army that marched on empty stomachs was already at a disadvantage before bullets had been fired or tanks had rolled onto the dunes. Every crate revealed a small marvel of American ingenuity. There were tins of powdered milk that could sustain 100 men for a week, stacks of canned peaches, pears, and pineapple slices, and sealed packets of instant soup enriched with dehydrated vegetables and meat. Soldiers discovered jars of peanut butter, protein bars made from compressed grains and sugar, and boxes of powdered coffee that retained freshness for months. Even dessert had not been neglected. Tins of evaporated chocolate pudding, caramel squares, and ice cream mix that could be frozen with ice, harvested from nearby depots. Some crates contained bottles of concentrated fruit juice, vitamins and mineral supplements designed to prevent scurvy, fatigue, and digestive collapse. Each item was an artifact of planning, proof of an industrialized military machine that considered nutrition as a weapon as potent as the rifle or artillery shell. Steiner studied the layout of the depot carefully, noting the methodical stacking, the clear labeling, and the inventory sheets meticulously attached to each pallet. Every aspect of provisioning was optimized to reduce waste, preserve freshness, and maximize the efficiency of distribution. He observed his men as they touched tins and packages with trembling fingers. Their eyes, sunken and hollowed by weeks without adequate nourishment, reflected a mixture of awe and despair. Private Kruger held a tin of corned beef close to his chest, as if it were a talisman, a promise of life renewed. Sergeant Muller, meanwhile, opened a crate of biscuits and divided them among nearby men, the crumbs falling to the sand like sacramental offerings. They laughed again, the sound uneven and jagged, a forced mirth born from relief and embarrassment alike. Steiner noted the psychological dimension of hunger. These men, on the brink of collapse, experienced not only the physical restoration of strength, but the emotional shock of abundance. Their senses were assaulted by smell, sight, and touch. The sweet aroma of chocolate and baked bread was almost unbearable, stirring memory and desire simultaneously. Steiner pondered the disparity. On paper, German soldiers should have been capable, disciplined, and relentless. In practice, they were weakened by scarcity, with rations limited to 1,500 calories and supplies delayed by ambushes, bogged vehicles, and miscommunication. Every kilometer of desert became an ordeal. Soldiers' feet blistered under sand that could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun. Dehydration caused headaches, confusion, and dizziness, and thirst gnawed at their throats continuously. Even minor wounds could fester rapidly in these conditions, infections spreading unchecked due to limited medical supplies. Meanwhile, Americans marched on hot meals, water in abundance, and fresh fruit to prevent scurvy. They remained alert, disciplined, and capable of executing complex maneuvers with precision. Steiner's officers understood instinctively that hunger was not a temporary inconvenience, but a strategic liability. The depot also revealed the importance of supplementary equipment. American soldiers possessed collapsible cooking stoves, lightweight pots and pans, and utensils designed to withstand the desert and the mud. They had storage boxes for spices, condiments, and even morale-boosting items such as tobacco and chocolate. Meals could be prepared quickly and calories were optimized to prevent energy loss. German troops, in contrast, carried heavy mess kits rarely used, often relying on scavenged tins or dried bread softened in water, cooking improvisationally over makeshift fires. Even when fuel was available, it was rationed, preventing hot meals from being prepared consistently. Every innovation, every thoughtfully packaged ration compounded the advantage of the Americans. Steiner reflected on the human cost. Soldiers like Kruger and Muller were not merely hungry, they were chronically malnourished. Muscles wasted, skins sun-scorched, and minds clouded with fatigue, they fought not just the enemy, but the limitations of their own bodies. The contrast with Americans was painfully clear. One army marched fueled by science, planning, and abundance. The other dragged itself forward, sustained by memory and stubbornness alone. He observed men tearing open tins and distributing the contents cautiously, not wanting to consume too quickly, for fear of digestive collapse. They ate small bites of corned beef and biscuits, savoring each morsel while sharing stories of their deprivation in low voices. Steiner realized that every K-ration consumed by the enemy was a multiplier of combat effectiveness, while every day of deprivation for his own men was a slow attrition of strength, morale, and willpower. By midday, some of Steiner's men had begun experimenting with new combinations. Powdered eggs mixed with chocolate powder, biscuits softened in evaporated milk, peanut butter spread over dried fruit. Laughter and grim smiles intermingled as they discovered flavors and textures they had not experienced in weeks. Sergeant Muller, with a twinkle of humor, remarked that he might cry for joy if he tasted ice cream again. Steiner allowed the moment, aware that morale, like strength, could be replenished by nourishment, even if temporarily. The psychological dimension of feeding an army became undeniable. Hunger sapped courage, lowered initiative, and increased susceptibility to despair. An army properly fed could march farther, fight longer, and respond more flexibly to unexpected challenges. The disparity also extended to water and hydration. American soldiers possessed water purification tablets, canteens with filtering systems, and field manuals detailing the precise amount of water required per man per day. German troops often consumed water from questionable wells or exhausted local sources, risking disease and dehydration. Even when water was available, it was insufficient for maintaining body temperature and performance under the desert sun. The combination of caloric deficit and dehydration created a feedback loop of fatigue and vulnerability, a stark reminder that survival in harsh environments was dictated by preparation and supply as much as courage or discipline. Steiner continued his survey, making careful notes for future reference. Each crate became a symbol, each ration a lesson. Powdered eggs, canned meats, biscuits, chocolate, coffee, and sugar were not merely food, they were instruments of strategy. He catalogued vitamins and mineral supplements, noting that American soldiers had no shortage of nutrients necessary for maintaining cognitive function and physical stamina. Even simple items, such as canned fruit or evaporated milk, demonstrated attention to detail. Each item preserved freshness, maximized caloric intake, and contributed to morale. By contrast, German rations were ad hoc and inconsistent, leaving soldiers to improvise, scavenge, and endure deficiencies that weakened the entire unit. Nightfall approached. The German troops, having consumed what they could carry, settled on the edge of the depot. They ate slowly, portions rationed to last the following day, and discussed quietly the implications of the abundance they had witnessed. Steiner watched the stars emerge over the desert, their cold light reflecting off the sand and the stacks of crates, and he contemplated the broader consequences of this discovery. Hunger was not a temporary inconvenience, it was a weapon, a multiplier of weakness. Well-fed soldiers were capable of complex maneuvers, extended marches, and sustained combat operations. Starved soldiers, no matter their discipline or courage, were diminished, their potential eroded by physiological necessity. Steiner addressed his officers quietly, knowing the men would listen. "Take note of what we have seen," he said. "This is not just a depot of food. It is a fortress of strength, morale, and endurance. Every day we march hungry, the enemy grows stronger without firing a shot. Every ration they consume is an advantage we cannot ignore." The words hung in the cool night air, echoing softly across the dunes. Officers nodded solemnly, some already considering adjustments to rationing, logistics, and planning. The contrast between survival and effectiveness, between starvation and nourishment, had never been so vivid, nor so impossible to ignore. By the early hours of February 18th, Steiner's men had prepared to move. They took what provisions they could carry, leaving the majority behind. Crates of K-rations, powdered milk, chocolate, canned meats, and biscuits stretched across the depot, a tangible monument to industrial planning, foresight, and the strategic power of nourishment. Steiner watched silently, a profound unease settling in his chest. The desert had not changed. The sun would rise again. The sand would burn. And yet the Americans, armed with food, water, and morale, would march with renewed vigor. He turned back to his men, their faces illuminated by lantern light, and whispered, "Hunger is not merely absence of food. It is a weapon. And today, we have seen the enemy wield it better than we ever could." Months of inadequate rations had left the German army weakened, long before Farana. Medical records hastily compiled by fatigued doctors in field hospitals documented the harrowing consequences of chronic undernourishment, weight loss exceeding 50 pounds in some men, persistent fatigue, and heightened susceptibility to disease. Skin was pallid, eyes sunken, and the tremors in hands betrayed the lack of essential nutrients. Wounds healed slowly, sometimes taking weeks rather than days, and infections spread unchecked due to malnutrition and poor sanitation. Cold injuries were rampant. Frostbite, chilblains, and gangrene claimed fingers and toes when winter in Eastern Europe struck with its familiar cruelty. By the winter of 1941, on the Eastern Front, soldiers clad in summer uniforms endured temperatures of -30 Celsius or lower. The cruel wind sliced through wool coats and boots, worn thin from months of relentless marching, failed to protect feet from frostbite. Starvation compounded suffering. Troops scavenged wherever they could, competing with civilians, prisoners of war, and even animals for scraps of food or remnants from abandoned homes and fields. Each bite salvaged from discarded rations was a temporary reprieve, yet one that could never satisfy the body's mounting demands. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Steiner observed his men, now staring at crates of food they could not carry back, their faces etched with longing and disbelief. The weight of helplessness pressed upon them as heavily as their packs, now empty save for water canteens and ammunition. He remembered Stalingrad, vividly recalling the morning the first snow fell on encircled divisions and men subsisting on a mere 100 grams of bread daily, roughly 400 calories. Soldiers had scavenged tirelessly, eating horse meat, frozen roots, or the occasional morsel from nearby homes. Morale had collapsed entirely. Soldiers were unable to lift heavy equipment, artillery crews could not move cannons without risking collapse, and operations slowed to a crawl. Mistakes multiplied, not from incompetence, but from sheer exhaustion and the mental fog induced by chronic hunger. Commanders, long trained to rely on discipline and order, realized painfully that hunger kills more quietly than bullets, yet its effects were just as fatal, eroding strength, focus, and the will to fight. The depot at Farana presented a stark contrast. Here, the Americans flourished, an embodiment of industrial logistics and foresight. Reports confirmed that in garrison, U.S. troops consumed an average of 3,400 to 3,800 calories per day. On active operations, daily intake sometimes exceeded 4,000 calories, bolstered by K-rations, canned meat, biscuits, powdered milk, and supplementary fresh or dehydrated provisions. Hot meals were standard, and mobile kitchens ensured that even in the field, soldiers could enjoy scrambled eggs, roasted meat, vegetables cooked in olive oil, and bread baked daily. Ice cream, far from a luxury, was considered essential for mental well-being, distributed in tins and occasionally frozen. using ice salvaged from supply depots. Coffee was plentiful, sugar abundant, and chocolate distributed as both a treat and a morale booster. Vitamins and mineral supplements were standard, preventing scurvy, weakness, and the breakdown of cognitive faculties. American logistics had transformed feeding soldiers from a mundane chore into a strategic weapon, directly enhancing combat readiness and resilience. Soldiers ate, rested, and engaged with vigor. Every bite they consumed was an investment in mobility, accuracy, and endurance. Steiner felt a chill as he watched the disparity unfold. This was not merely a difference of fortune or luck. It was a structural disparity embedded in the industrial and logistical frameworks of the respective armies. German supply lines were overextended, reliant on a patchwork of scarce trucks, primitive rail lines, and captured enemy provisions. Every convoy faced ambushes, mechanical failures, and the merciless desert sun or eastern winter. Food meant fuel, and fuel meant survival. Yet, trucks broke down under sand and ice alike. Soldiers marched, often carrying not only personal kits, but the sheeshes of comrades who could not continue. By contrast, the Americans possessed industrial might. Behind them, delivering supplies reliably, on time, and in abundance. Each crate, each package, each ration was pre-planned, its calorie count, shelf life, and utility accounted for. No detail was overlooked. Every soldier could march, fight, and endure with the confidence that nourishment awaited him at the end of the day. Steiner's men attempted to consume what they could, but scarcity had left the majority of them incapable of eating more than a few bites. Private Wilhelm Kruger, 24, held a tin of chocolate in trembling hands, unable to process the abundance before him. Sergeant Dietrich Müller, 27, pried open a box of biscuits and tried to chew methodically, worried that consuming too much might overwhelm his stomach, weakened by months of starvation. Soldiers passed around tins of evaporated milk, powdered eggs, and peanut butter, tasting cautiously, sharing fragments like precious treasure. Laughter broke occasionally, sharp and brittle, yet the undercurrent of anxiety was unmistakable. The mind, Steiner knew, responded to food as much as the body. A soldier nourished not only heals faster, but thinks more clearly, reacts more decisively, and experiences fear and stress differently. In contrast, the German soldiers were slow to respond to commands, fatigued and prone to errors caused by malnutrition. He reflected on the broader human cost. Starvation was not merely a physical burden. It reshaped behavior, decision-making, and morale. Soldiers faced profound psychological stress, battling both the visible enemy and the invisible force of hunger gnawing relentlessly at their bodies. In field hospitals, doctors documented symptoms consistent with severe malnutrition, swollen abdomens, sunken eyes, brittle nails, and hair loss. Patients frequently experienced dizziness, fainting spells, and confusion. Cold and heat intensified the problem, as the body, deprived of adequate calories, could not maintain core temperature efficiently. Even minor wounds risked infection and slow healing, with some men losing fingers, toes, or limbs. Steiner understood the duality of hunger. It attacked both body and mind, reducing operational effectiveness long before the battle line was reached. The Americans, in contrast, approached nutrition as an extension of combat strategy. Meals were designed not only for sustenance, but for maximal performance, considering protein, fat, carbohydrate ratios, and micronutrients necessary for endurance. Even in remote desert outposts, soldiers enjoyed hot meals, water in abundance, and desserts to sustain morale. Fresh fruit and vegetables, carefully rationed, prevented scurvy. Supplements countered deficiencies, ensuring the men remained physically and mentally robust. Every meal strengthened muscles, renewed energy, and reinforced mental resilience. Soldiers marched longer, fought longer, and responded with greater agility and clarity of thought. The Americans understood that a well-fed soldier was not merely nourished, but transformed into a force multiplier, capable of achieving feats impossible for those deprived. Steiner could not ignore the implications. Hunger, he realized, was a silent enemy. It reduced combat effectiveness, undermined discipline and introduced errors into every operation. A hungry soldier, even with courage and training, lacked the endurance, focus, and judgment to sustain prolonged engagement. Commanders understood that food shortages could lead to retreat, surrender, or collapse of entire units without a single shot being fired. Yet, in Farana, the disparity was palpable. While German soldiers struggled with faintness and weakness, American troops maintained a standard of readiness that appeared effortless. Their bodies were fortified, their minds sharp, and their morale high. Every crate in the depot symbolized an advantage that no tactical maneuver could overcome: nourishment as strategy. Steiner moved among the men, observing reactions. Some, like Kruger, clutched tins as if they were sacred relics. Others, exhausted and unable to consume much, stared at the stacks with longing, understanding the cruel gap between what they had endured and what their enemy had enjoyed. Discussion arose in hushed tones about previous campaigns, from North Africa to the Eastern Front, recalling the constant gnaw of hunger, the improvisation needed to survive, and the despair that came with empty stomachs. They spoke of frostbite, starvation, and slow-moving supply trains, comparing those hardships with the logistical perfection embodied by the Americans. Every memory of deprivation underscored the inequity and amplified the sense of vulnerability. By evening, the soldiers had managed to pack what they could carry: small tins of chocolate, biscuits, powdered eggs, and peanut butter. They left behind the majority, unable to transport the abundance that symbolized both hope and frustration. Steiner observed quietly, contemplating the broader lessons. Hunger, deprivation, and logistical failure were not just tactical disadvantages, they were moral and human costs. Every day spent marching with insufficient rations translated into diminished capacity, reduced cohesion, and incremental loss of life and health. Meanwhile, a well-fed soldier, nurtured with careful planning, became a weapon in his own right. The American system of supply had transformed feeding men from necessity to strategic advantage, one that could decide battles without a shot fired. Steiner addressed his officers quietly, under the dim light of lanterns. "We have seen today the cost of insufficient planning," he said. "It is not merely about what we carry on our backs, but what our bodies carry. Hunger diminishes courage, saps intelligence, and undermines every effort we make. Our enemy has turned nourishment into power, into a silent weapon. Every ration they consume strengthens them beyond the battlefield. Every day we march hungry. We weaken ourselves before combat begins." Officers nodded solemnly, absorbing the gravity of his words. They recognized that logistical failure, deprivation, and hunger were as lethal as artillery, as decisive as machine guns. Survival depended as much on planning and supply as on courage or discipline. The night fell over Farana. German soldiers rested on the edge of the depot, their small portions distributed carefully to avoid overwhelming, weakened stomachs. The moon cast a cold light over the crates, illuminating the stark contrast between abundance and deprivation. Steiner lingered, contemplating the human cost: the weakened bodies, the slow-healing wounds, the trembling hands, and hollow eyes of men who had marched beyond the limits of endurance. Hunger was an enemy, invisible yet omnipresent, a force capable of shaping campaigns, determining victories, and claiming lives without firing a single shot. By dawn, they would resume their march, burdened by fatigue and weakened by months of deprivation, while, across the desert and ocean, well-fed American soldiers would advance with vigor, strategy, and strength renewed. Steiner finally spoke to his men before they moved, his voice low but firm. "Remember this," he said. "The body is a battlefield, and the stomach is its commander. Neglect it, and all else fails." Today we witness the consequences firsthand. Hunger is a weapon wielded by those who plan, by those who provision. Every step we take, every order we execute, every bullet we fire is influenced by what we have or have not eaten. Do not forget what we have seen. His words echoed into the night, a solemn acknowledgement that the human cost of war was measured not only in blood, but in empty stomachs, weakened muscles, and the silent erosion of endurance. By the third day in Farana, Colonel Friedrich Steiner, and his officers had completed a meticulous catalogue of the captured supplies, documenting every asset with precision born of years of military experience. The depot, sprawling across several acres of arid terrain, contained not only vehicles, weapons, and fuel, but an overwhelming abundance of food, more than any single division could consume in months. Wooden crates marked with American insignia were stacked meticulously in rows. Their contents revealed to be an array of K rations, Type A and B field rations, canned meats, vegetables, powdered milk, chocolate, biscuits, sugar, coffee, and even tins of ice cream mix. The sight was simultaneously staggering and demoralizing. Officers gathered in corners of the depot, speaking in hushed tones while glancing at the men, their young soldiers gaunt and hollow-eyed from weeks of insufficient rations. Private Wilhelm Kruger, 24, had found a tin of condensed milk and clutched it tightly, as if holding a fragile treasure, while Sergeant Dietrich Müller, 27, nervously cradled a box of chocolate, unable to reconcile the abundance with their own prolonged deprivation. The soldiers' hunger, now painfully visible, served as a vivid reminder of the gap between their suffering and the nourishment that sustained the enemy. The Americans ate 3,400 to 4,000 calories daily, hot meals served at precise intervals, supplemented with fruits, vegetables, and even treats considered essential for morale. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht staggered along the desert roads and snowed plains, subsisting on a fraction of that, rationed thin bread, meager soups, and scavenged scraps, their endurance and effectiveness steadily eroded by malnutrition. Steiner contemplated the implications for future operations, recognizing the cold arithmetic of war. Even the most disciplined soldier cannot fight effectively at half strength. He calculated in his mind the likely outcomes of a month-long campaign in Europe or North Africa. Each German division would face American forces, well-fed, rested, and supplied with hot meals twice daily. Every offensive, no matter how skillfully planned, risked being undermined by exhaustion and weakness. Morale, already fragile from months of deprivation and the physical toll of relentless marching, could collapse before the first artillery shell was fired. He pictured his soldiers, weakened by chronic hunger, attempting to man heavy artillery, operate trucks over desert terrain, or respond to sudden counterattacks, their energy sapped by the inadequacy of previous rations. The contrast with the Americans could not have been starker. While German soldiers struggled to maintain even minimal caloric intake, American field kitchens ensured that every meal provided not only sustenance, but a psychological boost. Hot eggs in the morning, stews at noon, and meats with vegetables at night were supplemented by chocolate and sugar, boosting morale, fortifying strength, and maintaining focus in ways that Steiner understood instinctively as decisive. Food, in the American framework, was not merely nutrition, it was strategy, a weapon deployed before bullets or shells were ever expended. Each crate represented the difference between a soldier capable of enduring a day's march and one whose body threatened to betray him under stress. The officers shared a bitter understanding. For years, German military doctrine had relied on ingenuity, improvisation, and the ability to adapt to scarcity. Commanders expected soldiers to capture enemy supplies, stretch existing rations, and live off the land when possible. This strategy had proven sufficient in Poland and France, where campaigns were short and the infrastructure intact. The rapid advances and minimal resistance allowed soldiers to sustain themselves without prolonged deprivation. But in extended theaters such as Russia and North Africa, the logic faltered spectacularly. The combination of harsh climates, overextended supply lines, and constant engagement with an organized, well-fed enemy exposed the limits of improvisation. Hunger had emerged as a silent, yet inexorable adversary, undermining discipline, stamina, and operational effectiveness. It was no longer merely a matter of individual suffering, but a structural weakness that dictated the outcomes of battles before engagement even began. Steiner reviewed the inventory lists again, noting not only the sheer quantity of rations, but the diversity and quality. Canned meats of various types, including beef, ham, and chicken, were stacked alongside vegetables preserved in brine and powdered milk, fortified with essential vitamins. Chocolate, biscuits, and fruit bars were not only edible but designed to sustain energy and morale over long periods of exertion. Coffee and sugar, items often rationed to near absence in German units, were present in quantities sufficient to last months, even with hundreds of men consuming daily portions. Ice cream, a luxury in any army, symbolized the American attention to psychological well-being. Steiner considered the implications. A soldier nourished with hot meals, treats, and carefully measured rations could endure both physical and mental stress far beyond what a German soldier, deprived for weeks, could sustain. Every battle, every maneuver, every march was therefore skewed in favor of the American forces, and it was not courage, training, or skill alone that determined superiority, but logistics. The officers, including Major Heinrich Vogt, 42, and Captain Ernst Lehmann, 36, discussed strategy quietly. They calculated the limits of what could be carried, rationed, or redistributed. Even if the depot could be stripped of supplies, the Germans lacked the transport capacity to remove significant quantities. Trucks were insufficient, animals overburdened, and roads already compromised by desert heat or snow and mud in Russia. Attempts to transport more would slow movements, risk detection, and jeopardize operational security. The soldiers' eyes, already weary and sunken from starvation, seemed to plead silently for what could not be given. Steiner felt the weight of command more acutely than ever. Decisions about rations, distribution, and the limits of ambition were no longer theoretical. They were matters of life, endurance, and the very survival of units under his command. Hunger had become both enemy and constraint, shaping the battlefield in ways artillery and tanks could not. He reflected further on the human cost of sustained malnutrition. Reports from medical units illustrated the long-term effects on the body. Weakened muscles, brittle bones, slowed wound healing, and increased susceptibility to infection. Psychological consequences were equally severe. Soldiers starved for months developed irritability, confusion, and impaired judgment. Field reports from Stalingrad, Tobruk, and the Tunisian desert recounted men fainting during marches, collapsing under minimal exertion, and exhibiting reduced ability to perform even basic tasks. Commanders noted that operational errors often stemmed not from incompetence, but from weakened cognition, an insidious effect of chronic deprivation. By contrast, American soldiers exhibited resilience, sharpness, and a capacity for rapid adaptation, fueled by consistent, balanced, and plentiful nourishment. The disparity, Steiner realized, was not incidental. It was engineered through foresight, infrastructure, and the industrial scale of provisioning. The logistics of feeding soldiers had become as important, if not more, than the logistics of moving guns or tanks. Steiner moved among his men as they attempted to consume small portions of the captured food. Each bite was measured, eaten slowly, as if to prevent overwhelming the digestive system starved for weeks. Even the simplest morsels, a spoonful of powdered eggs, a sip of milk, a small piece of chocolate, elicited expressions of relief and disbelief. Private Kruger whispered to Muller, "It is almost unimaginable. To eat and not fear tomorrow will bring nothing." Muller nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he opened another tin, a faint smile breaking across his sunken face. Steiner felt a pang of recognition. The act of eating, simple and natural, had been transformed into an instrument of hope, a reminder of what normal life could have been amid months of deprivation. The Americans, with their mobile kitchens and industrial logistics, had institutionalized this hope, turning nourishment into a constant source of energy and resilience. As day turned to evening, Steiner convened a meeting with his officers, speaking in the dim light of lanterns. "We must understand this," he said. "Hunger is more than discomfort. It shapes decisions, reduces strength, and erodes morale. Our enemy has recognized this and has built systems to exploit it. They fight not only with weapons, but with sustenance, ensuring every soldier is capable of performing at maximum efficiency. We cannot match this merely through courage or ingenuity. Our operations must account for this reality." There was silence in the room, a shared acknowledgement of the bitter truth. The depot, with its thousands of tins, crates, and barrels, symbolized more than material wealth. It represented a systemic advantage that German forces could not replicate without substantial industrial support and secure supply lines. Steiner walked once more among his men, observing how exhaustion and hunger affected every movement. Soldiers moved sluggishly, their reactions delayed, their attention fractured. Minor injuries were treated slowly or ignored entirely because the body lacked the capacity to heal effectively. Morale, already fragile, remained tethered to fleeting supplies and improvisation. In contrast, the Americans, nourished and rested, would continue operations with sustained intensity, executing maneuvers with the precision of mines unhindered by the constant drain of starvation. Steiner understood that the disparity would manifest not only in strength, but in strategy. Decisions made on the battlefield were contingent on the soldiers' ability to endure, to respond rapidly, and to maintain focus under stress. Hunger compromised all of these, creating vulnerabilities that could not be compensated for with bravery alone. By the end of the third day, Steiner concluded that logistics, nourishment, and human endurance had become decisive factors in warfare, often outweighing tactics, courage, or numbers. Hunger was no longer a side effect of battle. It was a weapon wielded silently and efficiently, determining the limits of what could be achieved and the margin of error permissible in operations. As the sun set over Farana, the depot's crates casting long shadows over the exhausted soldiers, Steiner recognized the grim reality. Victories were won not merely through combat, but through the careful, calculated provision of those who fought. American forces had mastered this principle. German forces, strained by overextension and scarcity, had not. He addressed his officers one final time before nightfall. "This is a lesson we must carry forward," he said. "Every campaign, every maneuver, every engagement is bounded by what the soldier can endure. Hunger is an enemy we cannot fight with bullets, and exhaustion cannot be overcome with willpower alone. We face an adversary who has integrated nourishment into their combat doctrine. This is the reality we must accept. Survival, strength, and victory are contingent on it." The officers nodded solemnly, understanding that the human cost of deprivation had transformed from a background hardship into a decisive element of warfare. Hunger, Steiner realized, was no longer incidental. It was structural, strategic, and inescapable. The depot at Farana had made this truth painfully visible, leaving no room for illusion or denial. Steiner summoned his men under the blistering desert sun, shadows stretching long across the sand, faces gaunt, stomachs aching. He spoke quietly, not of shame, but of unvarnished truth. "Look at them," he said. "American soldiers are fed daily, hot meals, 3,000, 4,000 calories. They do not tremble with hunger as you do. This is a weapon. Not bullets, not tanks, food." His men absorbed the weight of his words. Starvation had already shattered divisions, slowed offensives, and killed more silently than any artillery. Steiner walked among them, envisioning future battlefields, exhausted, malnourished soldiers facing adversaries fortified by nourishment. Across the desert, Americans advanced with strength intact. Convoys delivered supplies, mobile kitchens served hot meals, and ice cream and chocolate bolstered morale. German forces scavenged, rationed, and endured. Hunger dictated movements, decisions, and outcomes. Steiner's officers knew the stark truth. Resilience, alertness, and endurance were advantages their own men could no longer claim. Years later, historians examining the North African campaign would point to Farana as a defining moment, not for the tanks or artillery captured, but for the lesson in logistics it revealed. Survivors recalled mountains of supplies, crates of chocolate, tins of canned eggs, sacks of coffee, and even ice cream, marveling at the abundance and quality. German officers who witnessed the depot carried the memory for life. An army's ability to feed itself could determine victory or defeat. The Americans had mastered not only fighting, but sustaining soldiers' strength, morale, and spirit. Hunger, deprivation, and scarcity were powerless against industry, planning, and daily hot meals. The lesson resonated through campaigns and generations. War is waged not merely with guns, courage, or strategy, but with food. On February 17th, 1943, under the merciless North African sun, German commanders confronted the full, undeniable weight of that truth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.